The Fuktui jungle in 1967 didn't feel like a battlefield so much as a living, breathing monument, an old green cathedral built from teak pillars and stitched together with vines that seemed to have opinions. The air was thick enough to chew. Humidity clung to skin like a second uniform. Sunlight, when it managed to reach the forest floor, arrived as tired, slanted beams, more rumor than illumination, caught and broken by leaves layered over leaves layered over leaves. And before we step any deeper into that emerald gloom, if you enjoy immersive, true-to-life military stories like this, take a second to hit like and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely motivates the author to keep publishing more intense, cinematic stories that are worth your time to listen to. Through that green dimness, a company of American infantry moved like a determined piece of machinery someone had dragged into the wrong world. They were young, most of them barely old enough to be called men back home, and they carried their survival the way their training had taught them to, in weight, in equipment, in the reassuring mass of issued certainty. The M1 steel pot rode high on their heads, iconic and blunt, the silhouette of American war distilled into a 2 to 3 pound dome. It wasn't just armor, it was a statement. It said, I am protected, I am prepared, I belong to an army that brings industry to chaos. And in other places, that might have been true. But the jungle had its own rules, and it didn't care about iconography. As the Americans pushed through a tight thicket of bamboo, the sound of them traveled ahead like a warning flare. Their helmets kissed branches with a sharp metallic clack that snapped through the greenery and kept going, hundreds of yards, easy. Chin straps, left loose or draped carelessly, tapped and jingled against steel. Packs creaked, canteens knocked, boots sank into soft earth with wet, sucking punctuation. Even their breathing betrayed them. Inside the helmet, every inhale and exhale became intimate and loud, trapped in the hollow resonance of steel. A man could hear his own effort amplified, his own heat, his own fear. It was like marching inside a drum. To an observer, they weren't just soldiers moving through foliage. They were noisy giants stumbling through a glass house. Less than 50 meters away, tucked into a dense knot of vines and shadow, a 4-man patrol from the Australian SAS watched the spectacle unfold with a quiet mix of disbelief and something close to pity. They looked like they belonged to a different war. No steel domes, no hard silhouettes. Their heads were covered in soft olive drab giggle hats, canvas bush hats with small drooping brims, or simple sweatbands made from torn green cloth that had lived a hard life and didn't care about regulations. Their faces were smeared in grime and sweat, their eyes steady, their bodies still in that unnatural way predators can be still. They had stripped away weight and armor in favor of something the deep bush paid for in blood, the ability to hear. Sergeant McNeil, the patrol commander, didn't speak. He didn't need to. He signaled with 2 fingers, an almost lazy motion that was anything but. His men stayed motionless, becoming part of the jungle's pattern, 4 irregular shadows among a million. McNeil watched the American lead scout pass by, eyes forward, his ears sealed behind the heavy steel shell of his M1. The scout was doing what he'd been taught. Scan with his eyes, trust his gear, keep moving. But he was deaf to the forest. He couldn't hear the way the cicadas had shifted their rhythm a few moments earlier, an almost imperceptible stutter that meant something large and human was nearby. He couldn't hear the soft rustle of McNeil's team adjusting weight just feet away. He couldn't hear the forest thinking. McNeil could. His own ears were open, uncovered, tuned to the world like antennae. In the distance, faint, he caught a tiny mechanical click, the kind of sound that didn't belong to birds or insects. It was the sound of a weapon being readied in a bunker line somewhere ahead, and it wasn't a sound you heard if you were carrying your own echo around your head. They're too loud, McNeil thought, watching the Americans move straight toward trouble with the stubborn confidence of men who believed their equipment could negotiate with reality. They're trusting their armor to do the work their senses should be doing. In the SAS, the jungle wasn't something you dominated with steel. It was a sensory medium, like water or smoke. You didn't crash through it. You listened to it. You read it. You let it tell you what it knew. And by taking their helmets off, the Australians had made a choice that conventional commanders would call reckless and fools would call brave. It was neither. It was math. They would rather hear the enemy coming than have a piece of steel protect them once the enemy had already found them. The last American soldier disappeared into the brush, and McNeil's patrol melted backward into the shadows, moving like ghosts in a house where the owners had forgotten how to listen. To the American military establishment, the M1 helmet was more than protective gear. It was a psychological anchor. Since the trenches of the First World War, the steel pot had symbolized a promise. We will do what we can to keep you alive. It was the visible sign of an industrial nation wrapping its sons in metal before sending them into hell. On fire bases in the Central Highlands, under artillery, in the chaos of a sudden barrage, the helmet earned its keep. Shrapnel didn't negotiate, concrete fragments didn't ask permission. The steel pot had saved lives, and every soldier knew it. The comfort of that weight on the head was real, but in the claustrophobic depths of Fuktui, that defensive mindset produced a dangerous paradox. The American infantryman was trained to survive the hit. The Australian SAS was trained to make sure the hit never came. In the jungle, visibility could shrink to 5 or 10 feet, sometimes less. Leaves and trunks and hanging vines created walls where a man could be close enough to smell his enemy and still not see him. In that world, sound wasn't background. Sound was the early warning system, and the primary flaw of the M1 in the bush was what it did to situational awareness. The helmet didn't just sit on the head, it changed changed the world. It acted like an acoustic chamber. When you wore it, your own movement grew louder. A pack strap scraping against fabric became a rasping shout inside your skull. A dry leaf crunching under your boot echoed as if the forest itself were accusing you. Even your heartbeat could feel amplified, the body's quiet engine suddenly audible. At the same time, the helmet's flared rim blocked subtle directional cues. It stole the ability to tell where a sound came from, the tiny differences in timing and pressure that let a trained ear point like a compass. In a place where the enemy lived in the unseen, that directional sense was everything. Wearing the M1 in deep jungle was like hunting in darkness with earplugs. If you can't hear the breeze change, McNeil whispered during a later halt, you can't hear the ambush. His men understood. They didn't nod. They simply absorbed it, because it wasn't philosophy. It was survival. The weight mattered too. Steel doesn't stay light in the tropics. The helmet soaked sweat, collected mud, took on water like a curse. After hours of pushing through tangled undergrowth, the neck muscles of a helmeted man began to fatigue. The head drooped. The gaze fell. The world narrowed to the boots of the man in front. The M1 didn't just make the head heavy, it narrowed the mind. A soldier burdened that way stopped scanning the canopy and the shadows with predatory patience. He began watching the ground because the ground was the only part of the world he could manage. He wasn't thinking about the enemy. He was thinking about the march. McNeil looked at the American trail and saw it plainly. Not cowardice, not weakness. Simple human limitation, multiplied by humidity and weight and time. To the SAS, that limitation was fatal. Their own headgear weighed ounces. A giggle hat could be soaked and still feel like nothing. A sweatband was barely there. Without steel pulling their posture forward, their necks stayed limber. Heads moved constantly, not in frantic jerks but in a slow, fluid sweep. The way a cat watches tall grass, eyes stayed up at horizon level, the zone where ambushers lived. For the SAS, protection was found in information, not metal. The best armor was the 3 seconds of warning provided by a sharp ear, enough time to sink into ferns, to flatten behind a root, to become a shadow again. The Americans were prepared for the moment they were shot at. The Australians were prepared to ensure that moment never happened. That difference wasn't theoretical. It was about to become painfully real as the trail ahead narrowed into a classic Viet Cong kill zone, one of those natural corridors where the jungle itself seemed to guide men into a funnel. As the SS patrol moved deeper into Zone D, the transition from the Americans' path to the Australians felt like someone had turned down the volume on the world. McNeil's team didn't simply walk, they flowed. Each man placed his feet like he was stepping onto sleeping glass. Clothing was taped and tucked. Metal was quieted. They weren't performing stealth, they were living inside it, letting the jungle swallow them and carry them forward. And the giggle hat, ridiculed by some outsiders as a sloppy bushman's preference, was a masterpiece of camouflage. The soft brim dipped and sagged, breaking up the human dome shape that eyes were evolved to spot. In filtered light, hard lines gave you away. The M1 created a clean silhouette. The SAS hats made a man's head look like part of the foliage. At a narrow corridor of old mahogany trees, the air felt wrong, too still, too expectant. The kind of stillness that wasn't peace, but held breath. McNeil stopped. He didn't freeze the way frightened men freeze. He froze the way experienced men freeze. Because a detail had changed. 100 yards to the left, the cicadas had stopped. Not completely, nature rarely goes silent without reason, but the rhythm had stuttered as if the jungle itself had flinched. To a helmeted soldier, that tiny shift would have been drowned in the internal echo of breath and strap and clatter. To McNeil, it was a siren. He tilted his head, listening with his whole body, and his gaze moved in a slow arc, relaxed neck muscles allowing a precise scan of canopy and trunk and ground. That's when he saw it, a faint geometric line where there shouldn't have been one. Bamboo, lashed in a way nature didn't lash, hidden behind moss like a guilty thought, a listening post. The SAS sank into the undergrowth, silent, patient. They pressed low without worrying about steel knocking wood. McNeil put his ear close to the earth, feeling vibration as much as hearing sound. It wasn't magic, it was practice, the kind of practice born from long days and longer nights where the difference between living and dying was a whisper. They waited, and because they could hear, they had the luxury that armored men rarely did: choice. The Americans had moved through this same sector not long earlier, brave, well-armed, and unknowingly blind. Their helmets had created a sensory dead zone, a bubble of their own noise. They'd passed close to enemies neither side fully perceived, a near collision the jungle had chosen, for the moment, to postpone. The VC squad was moving now, parallel to the American trail, confident in the belief that only one noisy unit occupied the area. They were listening for the giants. They were not listening for ghosts. McNeil's patrol heard them before they saw them. The soft drag of rubber sandals on wet grass, the dull wooden thump of a rifle stock against a hip, the subtle brush of fabric against leaf. He signaled, barely a movement. His men shifted like shadows, breathing. A VC scout appeared through a curtain of ferns, relaxed, ears uncovered, listening hard for the distant metallic clatter of Americans. He never heard the Australians because there was nothing to hear. No steel, no jangle, no clumsy heel strikes. He never saw them because they didn't move. 4 rifles leveled from darkness, and then nothing. They did not fire. Their mission wasn't a firefight, it was knowledge. Their hearing gave them that advantage, to count men, to note weapons, to understand direction and intent while remaining unseen. They let the squad pod passed within 15 meters, close enough to smell sweat and oil, close enough to hear a quiet cough swallowed back into a throat. When the VC moved on, McNeil felt that cold, familiar truth settle in his chest. A helmeted American unit in this exact position would have been forced into a panicked engagement, or worse, surprised into one, because they would not have known the enemy existed until the forest erupted around them. By shedding steel, the SAS had become hunters, not targets. The steel pot promised protection for the body. The soft hat guaranteed dominance for the mind. As afternoon heat intensified, the jungle became a pressurized steam room. Sweat turned uniforms dark, breath came thick, and the physical toll of equipment shifted from discomfort to tactical consequence. Miles ahead, the American infantry were paying the weight tax of their helmets. 3 pounds on a parade ground was nothing. 3 pounds after 6 hours of roots and ravines and oppressive heat was an anchor. The neck and shoulders stayed in constant tension, fighting to keep the head level. Fatigue collapsed posture, chins dropped, eyes narrowed to the dirt circle around their boots. Not because they were lazy, because bodies have limits. McNeil's scout, Corporal Miller, pointed at the trail where the Americans had passed, a series of deep heel strikes and sloppy scuffs in soft mud. The footprints told a story of exhaustion as clearly as a diary. When a man is drained, his reaction time slows, his movements lose precision. A vine and a tripwire begin to look the same. His world reduces to endure. The helmet designed to protect him in a fight was hastening the moment he would be too tired to fight well. The SAS patrol moved upright and balanced. They were tired too. Everyone was tired in that jungle, but their energy was preserved in small ways that mattered. Their heads stayed up, their senses stayed open, mobility remained theirs. The more you carry, McNeil used to tell recruits, the less you see. They crossed into a secluded rally point near the edge of a free fire zone where the jungle opened just enough to breathe. There, a team of American long-range reconnaissance patrols, LRRPS, the LRPs, waited to hand off a sector. These Americans were different from regular infantry, leaner, more hollow-eyed, men who had spent too long in green shadows and didn't quite fit back into normal conversation. They wore tiger stripes and carried themselves like they knew the jungle could reach out and touch you. And still, the rules of the big army clung to them. M1 helmets cinched tight. A young LRP sergeant stared at McNeil's bare ears and battered canvas hat like he was looking at a man walking naked into a storm. "You guys really go out there without the pots?" he asked, disbelief struggling with curiosity. "Command would have our heads. They say it's the difference between a headache and a body bag." McNeil leaned against a rubber tree, with the calm of someone who trusted his own methods more than any memo. He offered a small, knowing smile. No mockery, just certainty. "It's a difference," he said, "but your command is worried about the bullet that hits you. We're worried about the bullet that's never fired." He gestured toward the tree line, toward the thickness waiting beyond. "How many times you snagged that rim today? How many times you stopped to fix it because it slid over your eyes when you were trying to spot something small?" He nodded toward the American's jaw, where red chafe marks shone through grime. "How often you hear your own breathing louder than the jungle?" The American sergeant paused. Recognition flickered across his face like a match struck in dark. Miller added, soft and matter of fact, "We hear you coming from a mile off, mate, not because you're bad soldiers, because those pots turn every branch into a bell. And you're looking down because your neck's blown out. In our book, if you're looking down, you're already dead. You just haven't fallen over yet." No one laughed. The LRRPs looked at their own men, at the fatigue and the weight and the dulling of senses. Then they looked at the Australians, sweat-soaked, filthy, and somehow still alert like the day had just begun. It wasn't a humiliation, it was a moment of clarity. The elite Americans realized that while they were trained to survive a fight, the SAS were trained to own the environment. "Why don't you wear them?" the American asked, quieter now, like he was asking for a secret. McNeil's eyes scanned the horizon with unobstructed patience. "Because we aren't going into a fight," he said. "We're going into our house, and nobody wears a steel pot in their own lounge room." Then the SAS patrol disappeared back into the foliage. They didn't stomp, they didn't clatter, they simply ceased to be. For the Americans watching, the lesson wasn't about bravado, it was about silence, and what silence allowed you to hear. The debate became brutal reality during a night extraction near a Viet Cong-controlled riverbank. Darkness in the jungle wasn't just absence of light, it was a physical presence, thick and close. Elephant grass and tangled lawyer vines formed corridors that tore at sleeves and skin. The air smelled of stagnant water and old cordite. A squad of regular US infantry moved carefully, trying to link up with a downed helicopter crew. Nearby, McNeil's SAS patrol moved in parallel, providing a silent screen. In the dark, the contrast between the two units was almost haunting. The SAS were smoke, the Americans were effort, and tragedy began with a single metallic clack. A young US private, sweat-blinded, neck-tired, chin slightly down under the helmet's pull, failed to see a low branch. The flared rim of his steel pot struck solid wood with the clean, ringing resonance of a hammer on an anvil. In the pre-dawn stillness, it sounded like a gunshot. The jungle answered instantly. A hidden machine gun opened up, stitching rounds toward the sound, as if the noise noise itself had become a glowing target. Shouts erupted. Men hit the dirt. The night snapped into chaos. "Get down!" Someone screamed, but the jungle didn't wait for orders. As the private dove for cover, the helmet shifted, top-heavy, knocked off balance by impact, and slid forward over his eyes. For a handful of seconds, he was blind behind the steel rim of the very thing meant to protect him. His hands fought the strap, fought the weight, tried to shove the world back into view. In a firefight, seconds are currency, and he went broke before he could pay. From the flank, McNeil's patrol saw the muzzle flashes with wide peripheral vision. They heard the attackers shifting, heard the subtle repositioning in the grass. Without helmets to slip, without weight to fight, they moved low and fast, folding into the dark in a way that made them hard to track. McNeil didn't shout into a radio. He didn't need to. "Target left," he called, not loud, just clear, because he could hear his own voice, could place it in the world without steel echoing it back into his skull. His men responded with controlled ferocity, returning fire while staying mobile, while staying aware. They flanked, they pressured, they ended the gun's dominance the way experienced hunters do, not by charging blindly, but by using the jungle's own geometry. When the shooting finally thinned, when the immediate violence gave way to the lingering tremor of adrenaline, the lesson lay there in the mud like a statement carved into flesh. The helmet had not failed because it couldn't stop a bullet. It had failed because it had advertised a position, stolen seconds, and restricted movement at the exact moment movement mattered most. In the months and years that followed, wars continued, doctrines evolved, and gear changed the way it always does, slowly, reluctantly, pushed forward by a hard-earned pain. By the late 1970s and into the 80s, the old steel pot faded. Kevlar arrived. New helmets promised lighter weight and better profiles. The PASGT replaced the M1, and the army told itself it had improved the equation, and it had. But the deeper inheritance, the true legacy, was not simply material, it was philosophical. Modern high-cut helmets, the kind worn by top-tier operators, have massive cutouts around the ears. Not as decoration, not as fashion, but because the military eventually admitted, in design language, what the SAS had known back in 1967. A soldier who cannot hear is a soldier who cannot survive. Even now, for long-range reconnaissance and deep movement where contact is something you avoid rather than endure, many operators still reach for the soft bunny hat, still choose comfort, still choose broken silhouettes, still choose the ability to listen for long hours without sensory fatigue. Mobility and information remain the ultimate armor. The veterans of that green war, when they look back, don't remember the helmets they didn't wear. They remember the sounds they did hear, the click of a distant safety, the sudden unnatural quiet of birds, the soft footfall of someone who thought he was alone. They remember that shedding steel hadn't made them vulnerable, it had made them supreme. And the story of the helmet in Vietnam, half gear lesson, half survival parable, marks a quiet turning point in how modern forces learned to think, a shift from the defensive mindset of the industrial age to the predatory mindset of the modern one. A reminder that in any conflict, the most lethal weapon is rarely the equipment on a man's head, it's the disciplined mind inside it. The SAS entered the jungle as outliers for their minimalism. To many, they looked underprotected, almost foolish, men refusing the obvious safety of metal, but they emerged as architects of a different kind of warfare, proving that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is take his armor off, stand in the silence, and simply listen as the forest breathes.